As with many other things, I want to go to the resurrection. I want to go to the resurrection stories of Jesus in the first light of Easter Day. Actually, without the resurrection of Jesus, everything falls apart anyway. There's no Christianity. And within that culture, the idea that the prime witnesses to the most important event in the whole story would be women in tears is so counterintuitive that as a historian, I have to say nobody would ever make up that story. Interestingly, in 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul quotes what is now the shaped up and polished tradition, the women have disappeared already by the early 50s. Here's our tradition, and we know that people aren't going to believe us if we say he appeared first to these women. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's all very clear the first person to see the risen Jesus were the women. And particularly the first people to be told to tell other people that Jesus is alive again. Mary Magdalene and the others. Now, all Christian ministry flows from the announcement that the crucified Jesus has been raised from the dead and is now the Lord of the world. And this is just a cultural revolution that Jesus had up till then chosen 12 men who all let him down in various ways. He now transforms that, this is part of the newness of new creation, it seems to me, by saying, now actually this extraordinary explosive message is so subversive that the best people to take it are strange women who no one's going to believe. And indeed the disciples themselves don't. But they were telling the truth. And it seems to me we need to inhabit that story and that way of looking at that story and say, so was this just a flash in the pan? And was this just, well, Jesus, had a special thing about his mother or Mary Magdalene or whatever, but after that it all went? And the answer is absolutely not. Read Romans 16. Now, of course, most people studying Romans find it hard to get to chapter 8, let alone 11 or let alone 16, but Romans 16 is explosive. Paul greets all these church leaders in Rome, many of whom are women who are church leaders in their own right, one of whom is an apostle, he says so, Junior, and there's been a huge attempt to try to make out this is Junias, a man, but the scholarship is quite clear. This is a female name, and she is an apostle. For Paul, that means somebody who has seen the risen Jesus and is thereby commissioned to be an authorized representative. And here's the crunch. The first woman mentioned in Romans 16 is the bearer of the letter to Rome. Now, if you're Paul and you know in your bones you have just written a letter which is the most explosive piece of theological writing you can imagine, who are you going to give it to take it to be read under Caesar's nose in Rome? Well, presumably some strong man. No, a deacon woman from the church in Cenchreae. We assume she's an independent businesswoman, Phoebe, and she's on the way to Rome. And what we know about the way letters worked in the ancient world was if you sent a letter via a friend or somebody, the chances are, you can't prove this, the chances are they would be the one to read it out. They might well be the one to explain it to people who, faced with Romans, we'd have 1,000, I'd have 1,000 questions. So Phoebe, tell us what, so the probability is that the first person to expound Paul's letter to the Romans was a woman, a deacon from the church in Cenchreae. And I want to say, get used to it, guys. This is explosive, but it's the sort of thing that happens when new creation is going forwards. And to row back from there and to say, well, Paul didn't really mean that, and so now I then want to say, what are the forces in our culture today, particularly I have to say in America, which are forcing some churches and some people to fasten on one or two verses from elsewhere to say, oh, no, we can't have women doing this and that and the other, because that's a highly, highly selective reading of Scripture. And as with all other theological answers, the best place to start is with the resurrection of Jesus and then everything that flows out from there.
So in summary, in a sense, to Abby's question here, is it biblical for a woman to preach, to lead a congregation of men and women? You would say, on balance, yes.
I would miss out on balance. I would just say yes, it is. It is biblical, yes. There are particulars. Do you want me to get to 1 Timothy 2?
Let's talk about that, because that comes up in the next question. Yeah. Lisa in California, interestingly, two women asking these questions. 1 Timothy 2, 13 to 15, though you could expand beyond that. Can you explain what these verses have to do or to say specifically about women teaching, if they do at all? And specifically what your thoughts are on verse 15 in particular. Would you like to read that from
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things to say, and let me say I've written a piece on this, which is printed in my book, Surprised by Scripture, and so all I can do here is summarize some of the arguments. I've set it out more fully, and indeed in Paul for Everyone, the pastoral epistles, there's a chunk on it there, and those overlap inevitably. The first thing to say is that in verses 8 and 9 and 10, Paul is saying men and women don't go with the stereotypes. The men must lift up holy hands without getting angry and having arguments. In other words, men, we all know about testosterone. Just now you're Christians, learn to deal with that and don't be all sort of power brokers and so on. Women, don't think that your life is defined by having an elaborate hairdo or by having jewelry. That just plays into the idea that women are the pretty little things, the decoration on the side, while we men are doing the fighting, as it were. So he's saying, let's get rid of the stereotypes and learn a wise way of being human, which avoids those. In other words, it isn't that he's cross with women for wearing jewels. It's that don't get trapped in thinking that that's all that it means to be a woman, to be a pretty bit of decoration on the side. And then he says, this is my second main point, a woman should learn in peace, in all submissiveness. But the idea, the word manthaneto, let her learn, is the same root from which we get mathetes, disciple. And hesukia is what you have if you're a student. You have the leisure to study. The word scholar actually comes from having leisure to study. And it looks to me as though this is similar to what you have in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus is in the home of Mary and Martha, where Mary, shock horror, is not in the back room where the women should be doing the cooking. She is in the front room sitting with the men disciples, which means she is in training to be herself a learner, and then it's like somebody sitting at the feet of a rabbi is sooner or later going to be a rabbi themselves.
I remember when I had Paula Gooder on my Unbelievable podcast discussing this with Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who takes the view that it's all inherently sexist and patriarchal. And Paula was keen to say, of course, it came out of a very patriarchal culture, so we're bound to see certain aspects of that. But pointed out that in this specific instance, simply saying women should learn was quite radical in its day and age.
It is. And women would regularly, ever since Aristotle, who saw women as a deficient form of men, that actually women were regarded as not that sort of thing. And this, of course, has gone on in the Western world and still in some circles does to this day. But then the crucial thing then, I think, is the possibility, and it is only a possibility, that this is written to the context of Ephesus. And what we know about Ephesus in the first century is that, as we know in Acts, the great temple in Ephesus is Diana, or Artemis in Greek. And the cult of Artemis, which has this vast temple, one of the wonders of the world, is a female-only cult. And various people have argued, this isn't my idea, but I think it has some mileage, that actually what Paul is opposing here is the idea, well, of course, we in Ephesus know that religion is basically a female thing. So if there are any men there, then the women are just going to have to take over the leadership from them. And because we want to hold our heads up like the Artemis priestesses, where men aren't allowed to look in. And this would then be, verse 12 would then be a rebuke to that women should not usurp or try to take over authority from men. Now, I want to say, I don't know that that's what that means, but the key Greek word in the middle, authentine, is a very strange word, which when you look it up in the dictionary, it's got about 12 different meanings, one of which is actually to murder. I mean, it covers a huge range. Right. And then the question about the men there is, does this mean women shouldn't be usurping authority from any man or from their husbands, or they shouldn't be teaching their husbands, as though there's a husband-wife thing going on here, as though, yes, women teachers, fine, but maybe not if it's so I really don't know on that. And then the argument about Adam and Eve, rather like the one in 1 Corinthians 11.
If you read it out for us.
Yes. Adam was made first and then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and got herself into trouble. En parabasi gekon, and she became in transgression.
I should make clear for those who can't see, but you're actually reading from the original Greek here.
Sorry, was that a problem?
It's just, some people might assume, why is is he sort of questioning how to do? I just want to make clear, you're not reading from an English Bible at this point. You're translating.
Do that if you like, but I mean, so for Paul, this is a flicker of the Adam and Eve story,
right?
And I've heard it expounded both ways. I've heard, Adam was not deceived, but he jolly well sinned, whereas the woman was deceived, so that's all the more fault for Adam. But you could read it as that Adam was above that sort of thing, but in the story, Adam did eat. So it's not quite clear to me, or not at the moment, the different ways of possibly reading that. And then verse 15, which was specified, that the woman will be saved through childbirth if she continues in faith and love and holiness with wisdom. The point there is that in Genesis 3 there is this warning to the woman that you will have great pain in childbirth, which goes with the warning to the man that the ground will bring forth thorns and thistles, and you'll have hard work digging it. And so it seems to be Paul saying, okay, that was the Eve problem, the Eve story, but that doesn't mean that all is now lost, that Eve will be saved through childbirth. It doesn't mean she'll only be saved if she gives birth to lots of children. It means that the apparent curse on this painful childbirth is not the be-all and end-all, right, that God will make the way through. Now, so see, all of that, pretty well everything I've said, could be contested and has been contested. It seems to me that is as good a way of reading the passage as any I've come across. And my question is, why have some people taken those 3 verses and made an entire church policy out of it and been very fierce about it, which has happened, particularly again in America? We thought we'd kind of got beyond that, and it's now come back again. What's going on in the culture to make people say this is the defining thing, when they miss out so many other things in the New Testament? That's one little passage. How many times do we have teaching about riches and poverty in the New Testament? How many times do we have teaching about generosity to the poor and all of that? And many people who fixate on that don't actually seem to bother about all those other things at all.
For podcast episodes, bonus content, and to ask your question, sign up at askntwright.com.